The life of David. We're calling it Chasing the Heart of God. And I'm really excited about it. It's probably going to go, if not all of the summer, most of the summer. And man, I just love the character of David. I love who he is. The thing I love the most about David is that he's so messy, you know. I don't know why, but that just brings a lot of hope to me because he's not just the perfect guy. So I'm just going to jump right in here, and we've got a lot of ground to cover today. I'm going to try and cover it in a timely manner. But the way the Bible lays out, you got Adam and Eve, and then it moves to Noah, and then to Abraham, and then to Moses. There's a lot of details in there that I'm leaving out, but that's basic overview. Then to Moses, and after Moses dies, the Israelites inhabit the Promised Land. And then they go through a lot of cycles. They go through the same cycles several different times where they are following God, and then they drift away from God, and then they forget God several generations later. And then at some point they're conquered, or something happens, something bad happens, a crisis, and they cry out to God, and they say, God, please save us. All of a sudden they remember God when the bad stuff happens, right? They cry out to him, and God, in his grace and mercy, delivers them and rescues them. And then they remember God, and they follow God, and then they drift away from God, and they forget God, and then they're conquered, and then they cry out to God, and it happens over and over and over again. And we see the same cycles in our life, where we kind of drift away from God, and then a crisis happens, and all of a sudden we want to cling to him again, and we want him to deliver us again. And so we see that thing happen in our lives as well. Well, what ends up happening is that the people finally say, you know what? It would be great if we could have our own king. Then we could look to a king, and we could see someone, and he could be on that throne, and we could know that that's our leader, that's our God-appointed leader. God, why don't you let us have a king, and that way we can follow him. And God does not object. He knows it's not a great idea. He knows it's not really going to change anything for his people, but he goes ahead and agrees to it. And their first king is a guy named Saul. And Saul was a big, strapping warrior type guy, and he was a good warrior, and things started out really well with him. But then, slowly but surely, Saul started to drift away from the Lord, and he started to disobey God's direct orders. And when he did, God saw fit to make a change. And so we see that change in 1 Samuel 13, verses 13 to 14, where it says this, "How foolish," Samuel exclaimed. Now Samuel is the priest who relays the messages of God to Saul. And Samuel says, "How foolish. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end. For the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." So God is ready to make a regime change. He's ready to change kings. And in 1 Samuel 17, we see how that plays out and who he has decided would be the king. 1 Samuel 17, verse 12, it says, "Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem." So David is a shepherd. He tends his father's sheep in Bethlehem, which is a really small town in Israel. And so he goes back and forth, but his brothers are in Saul's service. They are in the army for Saul. So God was about to make a major change for Israel, and he was about to use this little shepherd to do the trick. Here's the deal. God did not pick the guy that we would have picked. God did not look and say, you know, this first king experiment didn't work out too well. I'm going to pick a sure thing this time. I'm going to pick somebody who everybody would look at and go, wow, this is the guy. No, he picked somebody who we would have never picked in a million years. He picks David. 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 12. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab, at the oldest brother. And he thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Samuel goes to find who's going to succeed Saul as king. And the first brother he sees of David, the first son of Jesse he sees, he says, surely that's the guy. He must have been a good-looking guy, a big strapping guy or something. Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, we could stop down there. We could spend the rest of the day talking about that passage. It's amazing. Needless to say, God doesn't do things the way we do them. God doesn't look on outward appearances. God sees the heart. Verse 8, then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse summoned Shemaiah. But Samuel said, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Then Samuel said, are these all the sons you have? Y'all ever forget a kid? Anybody? We have. I remember, I think I told y'all about this one time. We left Quinn at CC's Pizza after church. You know, we went to CC's and we thought we had everybody in the car and we drove off and Stuart Smith called me. Hey. I said, hey, Stuart, what's going on? Dude, do you have all your kids? I was like, I think so. Y'all all in here? He's like, well, I know you don't because I got one sitting with me right now. I was just glad he didn't wander into Sarah's secret. There is still the youngest, Jesse replied. I wonder if he said, oh yeah, there's still the youngest. You know, I don't know. That's the way I envision it. But he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats. Send for him at once, Samuel said. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives. So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. In other words, he was a stud. Good-looking kid. And the Lord said, this is the one. Anoint him. So why David? Why the one that was forgotten? Why the one that even his own family said, no, it's not going to be him? What made him uniquely equipped to serve as God's chosen king? Well, I believe that God used 4 things to train David to chase after his heart, and I believe he still uses those things to train us to chase after his heart. I see these 4 things when I read this passage in 1 Samuel 17, 34 and 35. It's jumping ahead a little bit. It's right before David faces off against Goliath, and David is talking to Saul, and he says this. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. What a boss. When I look at that passage, I see four things that I think are important in David's development. And I think they're the things that made him unique before he ever became king. And the first is this: he was someone who was familiar with solitude. By the way, when I go through this list with you, these are not going to be the things that the world would tell you are important. These are the things that we run away from, that our culture runs away from at all costs. We really don't want anything to do with these four things, and it starts with solitude. We don't want solitude. We live in a culture that's wired for sound. We live in a culture where everybody has a device and everybody's on it all the time, me included. It's a problem. I worry about me. I worry about our kids, that they'll never know the value of solitude. Because solitude is important. And when I read this passage about David, it says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. It makes me think that, he was by himself a lot. First of all, he's in this far-off little town. It's, Bethlehem, I've been there. It's kind of thriving now. It's a happening place now. But back in ancient times, it was in the sticks. It was like one of the 1,000 little towns that we have around here in this area. And David, if he was watching his father's flock, he wasn't really in Bethlehem proper. He was in the hills surrounding Bethlehem. So he wasn't in the country. He was in the country past the country. And he was in a solitary place. And I think the reason that's important is because David needed to learn life's major lessons all alone before he could be trusted with the responsibilities in public. He needed to be by himself. He needed to protect the flock. He needed to be all alone so that he could hear the still, small voice of God and become attuned to it. I love what Chuck Swindoll says. He says, if you can't stand to be alone with yourself, you have deep, unresolved conflicts in your inner life. Solitude has a way of helping us address those issues. If you don't know how to be alone, and there's a lot of people who don't know how to be alone. I see that in relationships a lot. People move in and out of relationships, and there are people who, they're never not in a relationship because they don't know how to be alone. Because when you're alone, everything else is stripped away, and it's just you. And if you don't like you, you're not going to like being alone. And if you don't know the Lord, you're not going to like being alone. There are a lot of people who don't like being alone, but solitude is one of the things that God uses the most in people's lives. When was the last time you got alone? I'm talking so alone that the sound of silence was deafening. No phone, no TV, no internet, no people. That was David's life. That's where he learned to be king. He watched the stars. He felt the cold wind on his face. He sat in the rain. He learned to endure the throbbing heat of the sun. Solitude was one of the teachers that God used to train David's heart. And it's one of the teachers that he'll use to train your heart. If you let him. Secondly, God equipped David not just with solitude, but with obscurity. David grew up in obscurity. He grew up in a small town. He really grew up outside of that small town. He didn't really know a lot of people. He was a relative unknown. He lived in the boonies. And sometimes God trains his best personnel in obscurity. You talk to men and women of God, you're going to find out that at one point they were unknown, unseen, unappreciated, unapplauded. Obscurity helps you from being distracted and leads to a focused heart and a focused mind. Chuck Swindoll says, strange as it may seem, those who first accept the silence of obscurity are best qualified to handle the applause of popularity. When you're chasing the heart of God, you got to get away from the noise. Sometimes I have to do this, Sometimes I'll get away, and I'm not getting away to escape responsibilities. Sometimes I'm getting away so that I can know that things are going to be okay without me around. That's a healthy thing. Because when you're always around and you feel like you are the linchpin to everything, then you start to be the key cog in the wheel instead of Jesus being the key cog. Every once in a while, you need to get away to remind yourself that you're not as big a deal as you think you are. Many of the great leaders in the Bible came from obscurity. Moses lived in the far reaches of the earth at the time that God called him through the burning bush. He had lived there for 40 years. He was purposefully living in obscurity. And God used that to train him for what was yet to come. David grew up in obscurity. John the Baptist was a guy who lived out in the woods, was a wild man who lived out in the woods and was obscure, and then comes out of nowhere when God prepares him to be the one who's preparing the way for Jesus. And Jesus himself lived in relative obscurity for 30 years of his life. God uses obscurity to train us. And he uses it to train us to chase after his heart, because when we live in obscurity and we go through a time of obscurity, we realize that we're not the big deal. He is. God uses solitude. He uses obscurity. He uses monotony. Monotony is not my favorite word. It just sounds boring. Monotony. But monotony is being faithful in the menial, insignificant, routine, regular, unexciting, uneventful daily tasks of life. The temptation is for us to tune out and to look for more exciting ways to use our time, but the monotonous things in life are the things that make the world go round. David lived a life of monotony. He did the same thing day in and day out. He probably never envisioned himself breaking out of Bethlehem. Like some of you, I'm sure he certainly got bored with the day-to-day grind, but monotony serves a purpose. The grind adds structure to our lives, and it forms habits and rhythms that can really help us. At one point in my life, I worked at an accounting firm in Dallas. It was a large firm, a big, prestigious place. I had the lowest job at that firm. And I still had to wear a suit every day to work. I know that's hard to imagine, isn't it? Boy, I'm glad those days are over. Whew. And I would go in earlier than everybody else. I had to be there first thing in the morning. And it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. I was on my feet the entire day. I had to stick to a very rigid schedule. At the time that I got that job, it was kind of a miracle that I got it. It was through a connection to my brothers. And at the time that I got the job, I was a college dropout. And I had no structure in my life whatsoever. I was as aimless as you can imagine. And that job that situation, that monotony, changed my life. It saved my life. I learned how to work hard. I learned how to stick to a schedule. I learned how to clean myself up a little bit, even though it doesn't always show today. And it was a great position for me, and I thrived in that position. I began to excel in what I did. I got a promotion, and I got another promotion, and by the third year that I was there, I was in the best division in that company. And then 3 months after I got that promotion, I resigned and went to Bible college to be a preacher. But God used that monotony in my life to really rescue me from the bad habits and the aimlessness of myself and of my culture. Something about that routine, it changed me. And there's something about that in your life too. We don't like routine. We don't like the monotony. The last thing you want to think about is getting stuck in a rut. You know, it just sounds awful. But what if you're not stuck in a rut? What if the day-to-day grind that you're going through right now is God preparing you for something greater? God uses monotony. He used it in David's life. When I look at that passage, I see solitude and obscurity and monotony in the fact that it said that he worked in his father's fields as a shepherd. And then you see something else in that passage where it says that he didn't just work in his father's fields. It says when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, then I would go after it. That's not solitude. That's not obscurity. That's not monotony. That's reality. That's the fourth thing. That's reality. Somehow we've gotten the idea that getting alone with God is unrealistic, that it's not reality. But getting alone with God doesn't mean that you just lock yourself in a closet and think about infinity. Getting alone with God means that you get alone to discover how to be more responsible and diligent in all areas of your life, of your real life. Whether that means fighting lions or bears, or whether it means following orders. Reality has a way of finding you, doesn't it? I mean, David didn't go looking for bears and lions. He just had a flock and there were predators. And reality found him. Real life hit. And real life is going to hit you too. You're going to have lions and bears that hit you. And you're going to have to fight. Think about it. If David had never faced lions or bears, would he ever have defeated Goliath? Probably not. And he had already faced the most ferocious things that nature could throw at him. And when it came to this giant, he was ready. He was the only one that was ready. And it's because God used that time to prepare him. God used the realities that he faced, the difficult ones, to prepare him. And God will do the same with you. God will use the realities that you face, especially the difficult ones, to prepare you. Here's the thing, and listen. Really listen to this. God doesn't waste a moment. He doesn't waste anything that you're going through. He doesn't waste your hardship. He doesn't waste your struggle. He doesn't waste your pain. Just like he didn't waste the bears and the lions that David faced. God doesn't waste those moments. He uses them. That doesn't mean that God causes a bunch of bad things to happen to you, but when bad things happen to you, because life happens, reality happens, when reality happens to you, God will use it. And He'll use it to grow you and toughen you and strengthen you and prepare you for what He has ahead. And if you think about your life, you'll think about where you are today, and guess what? Most of the reasons you are where you are today and you're able to handle the life that you're handling right now is because something hard came along that prepared you for this moment. We whine and we complain when reality strikes, and we play the victim, but reality is shaping you for something bigger. And I believe that God wants to use reality to help us chase after Him and overcome the difficult things of this life. Here's what I want you to do this week. That's all we're going to cover about David today. Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to realize that God uses solitude, that He uses obscurity, that He uses monotony, and that He uses reality. And He uses those things in your life to teach you to chase after Him. Here's what I want you to do this week. First of all, get away from everyone and everything. Find an opportunity this week to get away from everyone and everything. Don't abdicate your responsibilities, but find some time to get away from everyone and everything. Take a walk. That's a great way to do it. Find a place to go. Find something. You may look at me and like, Steve, you don't know my life. There's no way I can do that. You can do it. You can find time. You can find opportunity. You just don't want to. But you need to. Get away from everyone and everything. No phone, no Facebook, no TV. Get by yourself and allow God's still small voice to talk to you. Secondly, evaluate your rhythms. Evaluate your rhythms. Take a look at your week. If there's no rhyme or reason to what you got going on, make a change. You need structure in your life, and if you don't have it, you're going to feel out of control. And that's not good for anybody. And when you feel out of control in your structure, you become flaky. And that's really no good for anybody. Now look, this is a hard one for me because I've found that I fight rhythm in my life. I fight those good rhythms. I fight them, but I desperately need them. He keeps me on track, and God uses intentional people. He uses intentional people. So look, maybe you need to sit down with your spouse. Maybe you need to sit down with your boss. Maybe you need to sit down by yourself and just lay out and evaluate the rhythms that you're in. And determine this week, hey, I'm going to have a plan. I'm going to ask God for what His plan is, and I'm going to get to it. I'm going to be a productive person because God uses those rhythms in my life. He uses that monotony. Thirdly, make a list of the harsh realities that you faced. Make a list of the harsh realities that you faced. Write it down. For me, my list looks like this. My dad's death, my brother moving away from home whenever I was 12 years old, being a college dropout, Pierce's autism diagnosis. Those are just 4 things. I could list many more, but those are 4 key things that God used to train me to chase after Him. I didn't know it at the time, but when you write those things down, when you evaluate the harsh realities that you faced, and you take the time to list those, you're reminded of a couple of things. The first is this: you're reminded that you got through those things. They were hard, but you got through it. And you're reminded in that God doesn't waste those moments for you, that they weren't random and you're not just some victim of the universe. And the other thing that you'll come to realize is that you come to help a lot of people because of those very things. You might want to trade some of them in, but they happened and God is using them. This is the way God trains us. This is the way He uses us. He doesn't insulate us and shelter us from every bad thing that could possibly happen. But when bad things happen, God uses them because He doesn't waste a thing. He didn't waste a thing in David's life, and He's not going to waste a thing in your life. I don't know about y'all, but I can't wait to get into the life of David because it is full of rich lessons like this for our lives. I hope that you'll continue to come as we explore this deep, deep stories of this great man in the Bible. Will you bow your heads? Will you just take a moment of solitude with me now? Just get quiet before the Lord. And as you're quiet before Him, I want you to determine in your heart right now that at some point this week you're going to get away from everyone and everything. You're going to take that silence and you're going to recognize that God uses that in your life, and you're going to quit avoiding it. And you're going to find time on your calendar to schedule it in and to be quiet before the Lord with no one else or nothing else around.